A certain American rock band said, "It's the end of the world as we know it, but should we feel fine about that?" We're talking with Peter to explore end times, so let's start off with the book of Revelation. What is this book actually about, and how come it seems so crazy?
That's a really good question, Ben. It seems crazy because it is. One of the difficulties about trying to understand the book of Revelation is realizing that it's a completely unique genre of writing. So if we were to read George Orwell's 1984 or Animal Farm or C.S. Lewis's Narnia, we realize as we read these things that it is a particular genre that should not be taken in a literal fashion, but actually there's another message underneath the text. And it's not surprising for people reading those books because they understand what the genre is about. But when we come to the book of Revelation, because it is a genre that is pretty much lost in terms of the literary forms that we have today, we need to be careful as we read it in order to understand what the book is trying to say. So in many ways, the meaning of the book is found in the title, the book of Revelation. It is a book designed to reveal the things that are hidden to us, the things that are hidden to our eyes. And I say our eyes and us because it is a book that is as of same use today in our contemporary world as it was in the ancient world 2,000 years ago. So the book begins by John of Patmos writing a letter to 7 churches. And you'll find the number 7 comes up quite a lot in the book of Revelation, as do derivatives of the number 12 and the number 40. Because these numbers within Hebrew literature have great significance. So if you think of the 7 days of creation, so right in the back of the book of Genesis, so the number 7 is a number that has with it associations of wholeness, of creation, of something new, of something important happening. The number 12 invariably makes reference to the 12 tribes of Israel, which in the New Testament becomes the 12 disciples of Jesus. So it's talking about when you see the number 12, it's talking about covenant, it's talking about chosen people, it's talking about the nation of Israel and moving into the future. And when we see the number 40, that doesn't appear as often in Revelation, but derivatives are certainly there. It's about a time of trial or a time of season. So you think of the Noah's Ark story, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus is sent into the wilderness for 40 days. The people of Israel are in the desert for 40 years. So these numbers represent something. They're not necessarily meant to be taken literally. If I was to say I was speeding down the highway at 100 miles an hour, what I'm saying is I was going fast. So when you see these numbers or derivatives of them in a book like Revelation, it's the symbolism that these numbers represent that we're to take seriously. So the 7 churches represent the church, the complete church, the new creation of the church that is going to be God's people on earth. And if we read the letters to the 7 churches, we find, gee, they could be talking about my church. This is a description that is relevant to me and the church that I'm a part of. And it's not to say that those churches weren't in history and weren't communities of faith, but the book is written in a genre that allows us to see those same issues applying to our lives today. So after the first 7 letters to the churches, then John takes us on this vision where he goes into this heavenly place in order to see things on earth through a different lens. And that's when things get really crazy. And there's all sorts of, there's dragons, there's beasts, there's angels, there's giants, there's plagues, there's warfare, it's crazy because from heaven's perspective, earth looks very different. Some people erroneously think that the book of Revelation is about the future. It's not. In the book of Revelation, there is no future, there is no past. All time becomes present because John's seeing the earth from heaven's perspective. So if we could imagine that this is the future and this is the past in terms of linear time, it's like in Revelation, it's turned like this. And so the past and the future are seen through one lens. And if this is earth and this is heaven, it's like everything's seen through the one lens. So what happens in heaven is being seen and projected onto the earth, and what happens in the past is being seen in the future. And so some of the visions that John has is about things that happens in his past, and some are about things that may happen in his future, which happens to be our past. But for the most part, it's John's way of seeing the world through heavenly glasses, where all of time and all of place merges into one, and it gets pretty crazy.
We've established it can be viewed as crazy, but do you think it sort of feeds into the insecurity and hysteria of a certain type of Christian doomsday prepper, and they are out there, they're on YouTube and they're on the internet, and they take it very, very seriously as this is a book that is really telling us the end times are near.
Yep. And look, throughout most of the history of the church, there have been those doomsday prophets, the self-proclaimed prophets who think they have a special revelation from God, and they're able to interpret the book like no other person, and they can give you a date and a time and a place where things are going to happen, and who is the person who is 666, and the personification of evil, and the beast and the dragon, and what the 10 heads, the 10 horns, what that all means. But all of that is so wrong-headed that the whole idea of the book of Revelation is not about a particular time or a particular place, but about all time and all place. And as we read this book with good discernment, we realize that the unveiling that happens in the book of Revelation is for this time and this place, as it has been for all of Christian history. And so the book of Revelation is a warning, but it's a warning not against a particular person, but against a system of beliefs, a system that in the book of Revelation is called invariably Babylon, the idea of an empire that seeks to oppress. And so when we look at today's world, we might think of a system that, such as capitalism, that elevates profit over and against people. That might be something that we could look through the lens of Revelation and say, there's some warnings here for us. The book of Revelation says we need to be careful about systems like this that happen to eventuate.
Okay, so there are apocalyptic motifs in Revelation, but this isn't the first book in the Bible to contain such content. Could you please discuss a little bit about apocalyptic motifs throughout the Bible, and why is this a recurring image we seem to find?
Yeah, that's true, Ben. The apocalyptic literature dates back to like 1,000 years prior to the book of Revelation being written, or around about that time. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, 2nd Isaiah, probably more famously the book of Daniel. But also in the New Testament, there's the Gospels, in Mark and in the writings of Paul too, we find apocalyptic references. So if we think of the closest thing in our day that we would have to apocalyptic literature is like a political satire, a cartoon. If we think of the way that politicians caricatured, so if we see an image of Tony Abbott, he's invariably got big ears and he's wearing budgie smugglers, and if you see him in Parliament, his ears aren't quite as big as that, and he tends to wear a suit. But whenever we see the budgie smugglers and the big ears, we know it's Tony Abbott. And Kevin Rudd used to be drawn as Tintin. So when we see those things, even though it's not who it's supposed to be, we know who it is. And with the sort of motifs we find in apocalyptic literature, the same thing happens. When the literature talks about angels, or it talks about dragons, or this particular character that comes up in the book of Daniel, the Son of Man, it's a title that Jesus takes for himself. He does so because he's referring back to that literary form. And so when we read these images, if we read with discernment, we know the tradition they're a part of. The word angel in the biblical languages literally means messenger. So we shouldn't get sidetracked with big wings and flaming swords, but realize there's a message here that we need to pay attention to. The dragon or the serpent or the beast invariably is something. There's a warning there. That's dangerous territory, and it may be that particular images have certain aspects to it, like the number of horns and heads that may be drawing our attention to something that we need to pay attention to. But again, the specifics are nowhere near as important as the genre itself. So it makes for great discussion points and sold a lot of books, and that's part of the point too, that the reason why it's in this form, and the reason why we have a political cartoon, is it gets us to talk, it gets us to think, it gets us to analyse. And in one particular age, a particular symbol may be more important than the next. But we keep coming back to the book, we keep referencing this particular style of writing because its meaning for us is ongoing and finds fulfillment in different ways.
So the tone of Revelation counteracts the message of Jesus about forgiveness, love, and compassion. Do we need to excise these words of revenge, vindication, torture from our holy book?
It's a very good question, Ben. But because at the end of the day, we live in a violent world, and our response to that violence is at the heart of what we call Christian faith. So there are many people who are attracted to the idea of the violence in the book of Revelation, and that's not a very good thing. And there are many people who don't read the book of Revelation because of the violence, and that's not a good thing either. Because what the book of Revelation does is it juxtaposes the incredible violence in the world around us with the witness of the one that Revelation calls the Lamb. And this is the central figure in the book of Revelation. So when John of Patmos goes into the heavenly realm and he's in the throne room of heaven and the angels are singing and everyone's looking at these two scrolls that are before them. One has 7 seals, but no one can open the seals. And the cry of heaven is, woe is us because we cannot open the seals. And the call goes to John that there is one who is worthy to open. It is the Lion of Judah. But when the Lion goes to open the scroll, it turns out to be the Lamb. The Lion has become the Lamb. And we find here that the central idea in the book of Revelation that the way to resist the violence of this world is through non-violence. We will not overcome it by greater force. And in fact, all the violence and all the plagues and all the mayhem that happens in the book of Revelation, for the most part, come to bear no fruit. It is only when the Lamb takes center stage that things start to change. So at the heart of the book of Revelation, after the first scroll is open, the 7 seals are open, there's another scroll. And at first it tastes sweet, but it's bitter when it's digested. And in this second scroll, this tiny scroll, when it is open, there are 2 witnesses. And throughout the biblical tradition, for something to be a legal event, for something to have certitude, for something to be affirmed by the legal system, you must have 2 witnesses. And so the writer of the book of Revelation is saying this can be trusted. What I'm about to say here, these 2 witnesses are about to tell you something that needs to be listened to. And the witness of these 2 prophetic figures is that the way of violence, the way of the world up to this date has counted to nothing. And it's almost as like God will now change God's mind. Now that can be hard for us because we think the one who was and is the same. Can God change God's mind? But there are 2 things we need to remember about that. As we read the biblical narrative in the Old Testament in particular, there are a number of occasions where God seems to change God's mind. Moses argues with God on behalf of the people of Israel, and it seems that God has a change of heart. Now, we need to understand that because as people we're looking at a divine figure who sits outside of time, we can only understand God within time. And so we tend to put onto God our own understanding of how decisions are made. But in the book of Revelation, the second thing we understand is there is no time. Past, present, future all merge into one. So whether it's God changing God's mind or whether it was a plan all along or whether it's just the way it is and now we get to see it differently, I'm not sure. But certainly what we find with these 2 witnesses is that there is a new way of doing things. The 2 witnesses, when they proclaim the good news, are killed and left lying in the street. And you think, oh, well, that didn't end too well. But within 3.5 days, they rise to life again. There's a resurrection motif right here in the heart of the book of Revelation. And 3.5 days, being half of 7, is things aren't complete yet. The new creation has not yet come, but we're on our way. And within the second half of the book of Revelation, we see things change. There's a birth story. It's a birth story that we don't see at Christmas time, but it's the birth of Christ. But it's not about a baby in a manger. It's about the witness of Christ that comes from a woman who represents Israel, the bride of God. And this woman gives birth to a son and there is a dragon waiting to devour the son, who becomes a savior of all humankind. You don't see that Christmas card going around too much, a woman and a baby and a dragon, but that's what we see in the book of Revelation. Now, of course, that's a past event for John of Patmos, but we see that intermingled with all these other visions about things that may be in the future, because all of time comes into one. So there are a lot of violent motifs in the book of Revelation, because we live in a violent world. But Revelation's response to that is the Lamb, that we need to seek the way of non-violence in the midst of all that is going on around us.
So the idea of prophecy is quite foreign to contemporary society, where we equate it with superstition and sometimes mental disorders which distort reality. Is it time to reconsider the role of the outsider nonconformist in speaking words of warning and wisdom?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is, Ben. I think in our it's not just religious communities that esteem and value the voice of the prophet. One of the most popular children's stories I knew growing up, the fairy tale of the emperor's new clothes. And if you remember the story, the emperor thinks he's wearing these flash new duds, but he's not wearing anything. It takes a little child to call out in the middle of the parade, "Hey, the emperor's naked." That's the prophet. That's the role of the prophet. Often the one who's ignored, often the one who's perhaps despised because the word they bring is not one that people want to hear. Often from someone on the margins, from someone who doesn't have access to power, but because of that is not seduced by power and so is able to speak truth. Throughout most of human history, there have been those who have been living on the margins who we think are weird and crazy and we don't want anything to do with them. But they fulfill a prophetic role. And you know, in some cultures, that prophetic role is brought on by religion. It can be brought on by perhaps drugs. It can be brought on by behavior that is considered outside the norm. It'd be fair to say, I think, within the history of the Christian church, when the church is considered in the norm, when the church is considered central in terms of society's value systems, that's when the church tends to lose its way. You know, when the church is marginalized by those in power, then we seem to recover our prophetic voice. And we remember that in Mark's Gospel, for example, the witness of the good news and the coming kingdom of God comes from the desert, not from the temple. And in the book of Revelation, we find it as the two witnesses who were slaughtered, those who were killed. They don't enter the story on horseback waving a sword. They're the people who are despised and outcast, who proclaim a message of truth. So the book of Revelation not only is a warning to us about we need to open our eyes, but it's also a wake-up call to say, hey, maybe in this story we need to find out who we are. Are we the ones who dare to witness to the way of truth, even if it means people think we're crazy? Are we willing to pay that price in order to speak a truth that this world needs to hear?